Hi, this is Donovan, and I'm going to continue with our exploration of resilience uh, among LGBTQI and gender sex minorities. Um, now we're looking at the Jewish and Christian traditions. So let me go ahead into that. And so here I wanted to look at some wonderful work that's been done. Many different people have done this, but lesbian theologian and clergy person Nancy Wilson has a wonderful book that used to be called Our Tribe, Queer Folks, God, Jesus, and the Bible. I think she's updated the name since the original publication, but anyway, it's a great not anthology, but it's a great survey of all kinds of things within the biblical traditions about resources for gender and sex minorities within the tradition, particularly within the sacred text. One thing I would say about Nancy Wilson is that she was one of the pioneering clergy people and members of the Metropolitan Community Church, which is specifically a gender and sex minority founded and led denomination within Christianity. So we'll talk about a little bit more about that later, but I wanted to acknowledge her work on this. So a lot of people have worked on eunuchs in the Jewish scriptures, but she puts it together in a way that is very succinct. So I just wanted to bring that up and just point out that other scholars have noted that there are multiple genders in Judaism. And the rabbinic traditions have noted up to 6 different genders within the Jewish and Hebrew tradition. So one of those, most obvious of those coming from a biblical perspective would be eunuchs. So eunuchs are counted separately in the biblical text from men and women. They're also from children, but so eunuchs are in the Bible itself, particularly within the prophets, a separate category, and they are included in the covenant that's promised through Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, who's the major prophet of major in the sense of the book of Isaiah. That book of the prophet Isaiah is the longest of the prophetic books in the Hebrew scriptures. But anyway, so eunuchs are explicitly included in the covenant in Isaiah 56, and then in the Christian tradition, Jesus goes on to cite that passage from Isaiah when Jesus talks about eunuchs in the same way as these are folks who are included in the covenant. In fact, y'all should be more like them. That's what Jesus ends up saying about that passage from Isaiah. So the next thing I wanted to say is that unlike many folks in the Bible, there are a lot of eunuchs who are remembered by name. So there's a lot that goes on in the Hebrew scriptures. Not everybody gets remembered by name, and people who are I shouldn't even say that, other than men, all right, so women and eunuchs less often get remembered by name. So when a woman or a eunuch is remembered by name, it's pretty significant, because it is a rather patriarchal text and culture that it's coming out of. So these are just some of the main eunuchs that are remembered by name and where that they're remembered, particularly in the book of Esther, and that in the Jewish tradition, there's a holiday devoted to Esther, and this book gets read and kind of reenacted once a year in a festival or holiday. So it's a short book, but it's significant, and not only for those of us who are women and gender minorities. So anyway, just want to share a little bit about this with you, and you can look at it more later if you like. Coming closer to our own time here, in the Jewish tradition, there are ordained lesbian, gay, and trans clergy now. So the first rabbi to be ordained in the American Reformed tradition, I believe, was Dennis Eager, and she's pronounced, or Eger, I'm not sure now. All of a sudden I'm blanking how she pronounces her name. But so this is Rabbi Denise right here, or Rabba. Rabba is the feminine version. I'll introduce you to a trans Rabba shortly. but she's also the president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. So she's an out lesbian. Joy Ladin is, or Latin, again, now all of a sudden I'm blanking on how people's names are pronounced. That's very, well, you can listen to her TED Talk. I linked her TED Talk here. She teaches at the University of Judaism, and as an out trans woman. And I mentioned to you last week that there are certainly strains within Judaism, particularly Orthodox Judaism, where perhaps gender and sex minority people are not as fully embraced, but we're looking this week at places where people who are Jewish and gender and sex minorities can participate in their traditions. So I have a resource here on Jewish religious camps. A lot of different religious traditions have youth retreats or camp settings where folks within the same tradition, religious tradition, can come together and learn more about their faith tradition and practice their faith. So trans teens are welcome at some such Jewish camps and that Jewish religious retreat camp settings. And I also wanted to share with you this wonderful recent Black Lives Matter article from a lesbian elder in the Jewish tradition, and she's a member of Jewish Voices for Peace, a 90-year-old activist. So I just wanted to share that. Again, we're trying to be, especially since the structures of acceptance class, trying to be more conscientious of that the LGBT community, gender and sex minority communities, and of course faith communities are multi-generational. So looking at experiences of gender and sex minority people from across the spectrum of ages as well as faith experiences. Another resource that's great from within the Jewish tradition is this wonderful book called Struggling in Good Faith. And it actually covers a lot of different perspectives. So if you want to go a little bit more deeply into anything that I've just barely been able to touch on in the last 2 weeks, this book covers 13 different American religious perspectives, specifically looking at gender and sex minority inclusion. The reason I'm putting it here in Judaism, contemporary Judaism, is because the two people that wrote it are queer people of the Jewish faith. In fact, rabbis, man and a woman who are both rabbis, and they are the editors of this volume. So you can read more about this here if you're interested in it. And this is Rabba Rona. We worked together at Trans Lifeline quite a lot, and she has more information on those clobber passages that I talked about last week. She comes at those from a Jewish perspective, as a trans woman herself and as a religious leader in her tradition. So I'm going to transition now into another biblical tradition, which is Christianity. And like I mentioned just a few moments ago, the Christian part of the Bible, or the Gospels, I'll just limit myself to that. The Gospel of Matthew in particular quotes Jesus as praising eunuchs, this gender that is neither male nor female. Eunuchs, of course, usually were people assigned male at birth. However, the way Jesus unpacks this, Jesus is more specific than Isaiah was in talking about eunuchs. And so Jesus actually talks about how some people are born eunuchs, some people are made eunuchs, and some people choose to live as eunuchs. So when Jesus talks about being born eunuchs, that's been interpreted a lot of different ways. He may be talking about folks who are born with an intersex condition. He may be talking about people who we might now today call transgender. Sometimes gay and lesbian women who are cisgender have read themselves back into that text. And in fact, it may refer to being a gender and sex minority in some capacity, but in any case, clearly, whatever the person was assigned at birth, they go on, as Jesus said, for a variety of different reasons, to live as this third gender of being a eunuch. And then, like I mentioned to you, he praises the faith of eunuchs as that being a kind of faith that other people should emulate, that it doesn't matter how you got to become someone who lives as a eunuch, whether you were born that way or made that way by others or choose to live that way. It's a gift that God gives and that is to be admired. And in fact, the very first person, again, in the Christian part of the scriptures, the very first person who's not Jewish, who converts to the Jewish version of Christianity. At that point, Christianity is part of Judaism. So he's the first one to convert to following Jesus. He's black. That's important. And he's a eunuch. I'm using he, him pronouns because the text does. But in any case, it is very significant to show this is the covenant that includes everybody. This is a covenant that includes, and a religious path that includes people who are gender minorities. Because the very first person to convert to it is a gender minority. And not only that, but after he's baptized, he's told to go out and preach this and teach it to others. So again, the very first person that converts outside of Judaism, converts and goes on to become a Christian clergy person is a gender minority. So to say that that's not biblical flies in the face of Christianity's own scripture. So this might be useful whether you're someone within that tradition yourself who's been struggling with it, or whether you ever know someone who's deeply committed to their tradition and feels, I can't come out because the Bible tells me I can't. It's sometimes useful to be able to point people who are in that tradition back to these scriptures and say, well, you know, you might want to take a look at this. All right, for what it's worth. Another thing, this is some work I really, really love. Now, the work of, I'm really talking here about John Boswell's work. He was a Yale historian, and he passed away from AIDS. He's gay, out gay man. Cisgender gay man, as far as I think. And his work has been controversial because in part because the topic that he covered was controversial. But he had access. As a historian, he went into the Vatican Library, and he had access to some understudied, or very little studied, I should say, or often ignored ancient texts. He also looked at archaeology, like the mosaic that you see here on this slide. But he had different reasons why, looking at historical resources from ancient Christianity, he came to the conclusion that it looked like there was a sacred blessing, a rite, a liturgy that seemed to be more or less the equivalent of marriage. We might call it Holy Union. In fact, it was called Holy Union. But it was a sort of brothering ceremony. And, in addition to John Boswell's work, there's all kinds of work on, Kittredge Cherry's work. Kittredge Cherry is a lesbian scholar who comes out of the Metropolitan Community Church tradition as well. But Kittredge Cherry has popularized it, but there's long been work about same-sex saints who more or less lived as a couple. And so one of those couples, one of the oldest and best known, Serge and St. Bacchus, is pictured here. And I share a little bit with you on a kind of a synopsis, real short summary of what their relationship was like and why they were significant to the church. And they get decanonized in 1969, right after the Stonewall riots. So many people believe that they were decanonized because gay liberation came to the church's awareness, and the church didn't want to be associated with that, so they actually decanonized this couple who had churches dedicated to them and had a feast day. They shared the same feast day. Their bond with one another had been celebrated in the church for hundreds and hundreds of years, but all of a sudden they get decanonized in 1969. And their feast day is no longer an official feast day of the Catholic Church, but some gender and sex minority people who are still within the Christian tradition or are just practicing a queer spirituality still enjoy remembering them on that feast day. So I didn't want to just make it about one couple. Another thing that I wanted to share with you was an excerpt from Boswell's work. So he translated, he provides the original text of that ceremony that that brings a same-sex couple together in like a holy friendship, and they have this particular kind of bond with one another. It's a lifelong commitment. So anyway, I share some excerpts of his translation of that and a little link to more on that and a little bit this particular article. You know, if you want Boswell's work, you have to buy the book, but I mean, there's Kindle editions and things, or you can borrow it from a library, right? But this little article gives you some excerpts and gives you some background on, you know, Boswell's work being kind of controversial, especially in his time. So I said I was going to mention to you a little bit more about Metropolitan Community Church. There's so much more I could say about this. I mean, I would love to spend more time on this, but I wanted to at least lift up that they were founded right after the Stonewall riots, that Reverend Troy Perry, who was their founding pastor, and I think I've showed you his picture before. I show it in my personal narrative, the times that I've got to be around him. But anyway, so he was a gay man. He was married. He had children. He tried to live as a straight person because that's what he thought as a Christian and as a clergy person. That's what he thought he was supposed to do. And then, you know, over time, as his faith deepened and time went on, and his orientation didn't change. He came to understand, between the influences of gay liberation and his own faith experience, that he, you know, that some of us are created gay or created to be gender and sex minorities, and he saw that to be not a conflict, and so founded a place where people who are gender and sex minorities could worship in the Christian tradition, or could be ministers in the Christian tradition, and can do that as ourselves, as open and out as gender and sex minorities. Now he's also he's since then married a man, and they've been married for a long, long time. Another thing that the World AIDS, so in addition to having, he helped pioneer the Pride Parade, and I think I might have mentioned that in my own, when I was sharing my personal story. So he was one of the people that founded Pride Parades, and the first one in LA, where Founders Church is, where the first MCC church is. But they also pioneered World AIDS Day, which is now celebrated on December 1st all over the world. And I believe I shared with you in the slideshow of my personal narrative, maybe some of the liturgies from that or some of the prayers from that, but I have linked here to a more complete sort of PDF of the liturgy if you're interested. One of the things that's really powerful in World AIDS Day is that people who were told not only, well, I don't know how much you know about the early AIDS crisis, but people were refused medical care, they were refused housing, they certainly were not welcome in churches, and people who died of AIDS sometimes couldn't be buried. Their families would abandon the bodies. Churches would refuse to perform funeral rites for them. So it was a big deal that this church community not only did all those things, but has this day where people who were mourning those who died of AIDS could get together, say those names out loud as part of this liturgy, and everybody in the church, it's an interfaith gathering, it's not just Christians, but everybody in the church responds presente. Now this was founded on the border of Mexico in San Diego, so hence it's in English and Spanish, but every name someone says, the whole community responds presente. So honoring that life, honoring the spiritual presence ongoing of that person and the love that those living have for that person. It's a very powerful ceremony, and if you can think about it in the context of a time when we weren't even allowed to be present while we were living, let alone what was our lasting legacy after death, of a person who had died, you know, ignominiously as a person with AIDS. to be honored in that way, to be remembered and have their life and their love celebrated that way. Not only spiritually powerful, but also countercultural. You know, this is, I guess the reason I'm pausing a moment on this is to show how spiritual communities, queer spiritual communities of resilience are also resistance. That for queer people who are on a spiritual path or part of a religious community, it's not, these are not exclusively experiences of being oppressed by religion, but sometimes religion gives a voice of resistance in a very powerful way. Resistance to oppression. Yeah, I hope that made sense. All right, so I wanted to share with you, we'll get into this way more in week 4, and I hope you'll contribute to it, but some resources, if you are looking for resources as a person who's a gender minority, or to share with people who are gender minority people, resources for people of faith or people who want to connect with faith communities that are inclusive or even centered in gender and sex minority spirituality. So I won't say more about that. I've included this last letter to our allies in required readings for this week. I'll just make a mention of why that was written. Okay, so this last thing that's going to be in your required reading section, you don't have to open it from here. It was written by trans clergy, I guess I'm not allowed to say the names. We wrote it anonymously, but it was a collaborative effort, and it was in response to Christians putting on a World Day of Prayer conference to pray for trans people, and no trans clergy or theologians were invited. You know, and by now, if you've been in several of these classes in this program, you know you've encountered a lot of trans clergy. It's not like we don't exist, you know, but we were not invited to participate in any way to pray as Christians for trans people. So it seemed a bit condescending, to say the least. It was well-meaning. It was, I think, you know, we thought it was, at least. It was folks who wanted to pray and draw attention as allies to disproportionate violence against and hate crimes, murders of trans people. So the emphasis of this prayer event by allies was on trans deaths. But again, by not inviting any living trans clergy to it, it wasn't a celebration of those who still are living who are trans, and that there's also other aspects to our community besides being victims of hate crimes. So hence we wrote this letter in a loving way, in a bridge building way. That's why I'm including it as a required reading in the course. But how do you build bridges to religious communities, especially when they even mean to be allies and they're still kind of, maybe they're not burning a bridge, but they're definitely not building one. So it's an example of a thing that can be done, this co-authored letter. And so from here on, like I said, next week we're gonna narrow the focus a little bit and look more at resilience. We're gonna look at Latinx resources. Specifically, Lisa Salazar is going to be providing the lectures and some data that nobody else has. She did a pioneering trans spiritual pulse survey that talks a lot more about spirituality, and not just religion, but spirituality in general as a resilience factor for gender minority folks. And then in week 4, like I've been pointing to the last 2 weeks, we're going to really look at specific resources from a variety of different traditions. And there I really want you to look at what is most relevant to you. I'll spread out a buffet of different faith traditions, queer people in different faith traditions, resources. There's like a biography of a Buddhist trans woman. There's like a lot of cool stuff in there. So I think you'll have fun in week 4, but you'll probably want to choose, you know, 1 or 2 things to focus on, and then kind of hone in and narrow in on your final project focus. Okay, so I think that's it for now, and I look forward to what you have to share in the discussion and the assignment essay this week. Thanks.